Hello and welcome to another episode of The Food Fighters, the podcast fighting an apparent desire to significantly lower our food standards, eliminate British farming as we know it, and allow huge commercialisation of the food production industry here in the UK that will have disastrous consequences not just for our diets but for our daily lives too. My name's Nick Webb and I'm joined as always by Liz Webster, who's the founder of Save British Farming, and Ollie Fletcher, who as well as being integral to SBF is also a farmer and rural historian. It's been another very busy week, but today I think we're going to start with a big update on your legal campaign regarding the inheritance tax due to be imposed on the UK farmers. Liz, tell us what's going on.
Really exciting news to announce. And this is hot off the press. We have finally submitted a very large complaint to the European Commission. Young Ollie here, is an Irish citizen, and also he's an heir to a farm. And he's got a particularly compelling case around the inheritance tax and why that it's hugely problematic given Northern Ireland's particular position in the Brexit reality, that it's still, to all intents and purposes, in the EU. And that also, from our prior membership, inheritance tax actually ended up being a bargaining chip in the level playing field arguments, going back decades before we joined, because of decisions to repeal a thing called resale price maintenance and also never put in a buffer around prices. It means that instead of actually helping farmers make more money, what successive governments have done to level up with European counterparts is release the gas with inheritance tax relief. And that was really ratcheted in 1992 when we signed Maastricht. And so as a result, people have forgotten this because they think that tax law is a sovereign thing, which it is. Tax decisions are sovereign. But ultimately, the commitments around that with the Windsor framework mean that there is a strong possibility that the EU will do what they did with the sand deal case and actually push for the government to move on this. We are also, in parallel, bringing a case, a judicial review, to challenge the inheritance tax from Belfast. So it is a dual track strategy.
Okay.
And the Commission complaint is much wider because it also includes the American trade deal and the deregulation. And as I think I've probably made clear, it is obvious to me that these things are connected. The inheritance tax is shock therapy to deliver a fire sale for big global corporations, a buy up on the cheap. And so all of these things are connected to American corporations wanting to have ownership or more ownership of Britain. And hopefully, we are in a good place to push back against this. Look, legal cases are always uncertain, but I do think, and I've spent some weeks now looking into this, and I feel pretty confident that we've got the right argument, that we are right. And then with Brexit, because of Northern Ireland in particular still being in the EU, and because we have farmers who own land on both sides of the border. And so it's not fair. It's not a level playing field. And Brexit itself has made...
Just to clarify, Liz, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just want to make this clear. So Northern Ireland farmers are still part of the EU. So therefore, your case is that Northern Irish farms should not be paying inheritance tax because they are technically part of the EU and therefore protected from inheritance tax.
Yeah, in simple terms, yes, that's basically it. And also, this young Ollie here is an Irish citizen whose family own a farm in GB in England. And so it also relates to someone like Ollie. So ultimately, what we will end up with, assuming that we win this argument, what we'll end up with is a carve out for EU citizens and farmers in Northern Ireland from the inheritance tax. And then that means that because we're within a single market of the UK, that farmers who are wise can buy a shell company in Northern Ireland and escape the inheritance tax. And when I say farmers, I mean businesses, because it's not
Yes.
just farmers that are impacted by this. It's all SMEs, all private companies can do
Right.
that. So the policy falls on its head because it just doesn't work.
Right. Okay. And then the wider implications for that with the TCA, which is, in simple terms, the Brexit withdrawal agreement. What does it mean for the TCA? Is this stuff going to mean that the TCA is in some way invalidated as well?
Look, if you violate the TCA, then the EU will react with measures. So they'll threaten to, make electricity more expensive because we rely on Europe for power,
Hmm.
or they can sort of put tariffs on any exports, imports, and make life a lot more difficult for the
Hmm.
government.
So we're
So,
basically breaking the agreement of our new trade deal with the EU by if you breach the TCA, then obviously there are consequences, and this you think will be seen as a clear breach of the TCA. Do you? Is that one of the arguments?
it is one, as I've said, it's one of the arguments. Yes, it's a breach of the TCA. The deregulation is a clear breach of the
Hmm.
TCA. The American trade deal is also a breach of the TCA. And
Hmm.
the inheritance tax itself is a breach of the fairness. So it's not a direct breach in the same way as the deregulation, because that actually
Hmm.
applies to all of the UK. But what it means is that we've got an argument to push for a carve out for Northern Ireland citizens and EU citizens who own a business within the UK.
Right. So let's fingers crossed that your case is successful. And if it is, what do you think the impacts and the implications of this case could be? Do you think that the Labour government or any government will have to act and do something about this and potentially admit, do you know what, this inheritance tax, we've made a mistake here and withdraw it? Is that the kind of, the bigger picture here?
Well, look, I can't map out what they'll decide to do. If I
Mm,
was Prime Minister and I knew this was coming down the line and I sat down with lawyers and looked at how strong the case is,
mm,
absolutely I'd pull the plug on it, because politically it's toxic. It makes you look very incompetent. And Keir Starmer's already in a lot of trouble. So
mm,
assuming
mm.
Keir Starmer does get
Yes.
taken out by Andy Burnham, does Andy Burnham want to start his premiership with this around his neck, this albatross? I doubt it.
Mm,
So I hope it does go, because Nick, the most important thing about this is that we have farmers are in a very pressured situation. We've already had farmers take their own lives because of this. And really, that's what drives me forward to get rid of it.
mm.
It's a very, very nasty tax because of the way it's been pushed on farmers so quickly. And we
Yes.
do not have we do not have any choice but to sell the farm to pay the tax. And that's
Which means
why
the
it's
farm is
and
no longer a farm in that
personally for
same
me,
family.
personally for me, my son's friends, fiance, young, decided to, or was pushed to, making a terrible decision because of this tax. And
Mm,
that shows you it's not just about old farmers. It's actually what it does to the family farm itself. It's
mm.
incredibly hard to understand unless you're a farmer. But farming is a very specific industry which has had a lot of pressures for decades because Westminster doesn't value British farming.
And it does make sense. And I suppose, in simple terms, the farm is a piece of land. And if my dad owns a farm and the farm's in his name, he passes away and I have to pay whatever the percentage of inheritance tax is on that farm. I don't have that cash in the bank. I have to sell the farm to raise the funds to pay the tax, which means the farm no longer exists in my family and then can be bought up by anyone to do anything. It does. Yes, the farm is the business, isn't it? So I do understand. It does make sense. Ollie, you've obviously.
But it's more than being a business. It's a way of life.
Yes,
You
yes,
live in
absolutely.
it. It
Mm,
isn't like it isn't like I don't know, a normal business. You live and breathe
mm,
farming. You're in
yes.
it, and you've got generations who live within that farm as well. And so, in terms of, it's not like sort of saying, "Oh, I've lost my business." You know, when you lose your
No.
business, you've still got your house. When you
Mm,
lose your farm, you lose everything.
Yeah, your way of life. Yeah, absolutely. And I do understand. So, I mean, I think another thing that you did touch on there is that the highlighting the fact that there are numerous farmers, all British farmers essentially, are now increasingly stressed and worried about the implications of this tax and what it means for their way of life. Ollie, you obviously will be heavily involved in all of this yourself. What's the impact of this forthcoming tax? You know, what would the difference be for the farming community and farmers in the UK if this tax happens compared to if the inheritance tax doesn't happen? You know, if Liz is successful with this case and you guys can somehow abolish the inheritance tax, how much is that going to be a positive step for UK farmers?
Well, I've been around the country seeing different farmers from my YouTube channel, and it is striking the extent to which the inheritance tax sort of weighs heavy on their mind, and it's sort of the final point they want to make that it is damaging what they're doing. Because if you make capital investments, it increases the value of the land, which increases your liability, while obviously also harming your ability to pay the tax because you've reinvested the money. But historically, that has sort of been the model of farming. You wouldn't expect to make very much money, but at the end of the year, you would have a business that was operating, and you would hope, farmers are on optimism that your sons or daughters in the future might one day carry it on and have better times. But now, that nest egg, if you like, that has been preciously guarded over the last few decades by families, lifetimes of work are being threatened with being seized. So what are people doing it for? Loads of people have stopped investing, we've already seen, which obviously damages the wider economy, damages production. But I think if this goes really well, we may manage to completely revise the government's food strategy, because they can do the inheritance tax because they think British farmers are disposable. They think they can rely on food from abroad. They think we're already not food secure, as productive as British farmers are, so we are reliant on imports anyway. We're taking international prices anyway. We might as well save the subsidies, get rid of the farmers, and do something else with the land. But if through the TCA challenge, if we can say, no, you're not allowed to deregulate standards because of Northern Ireland, you can't allow cheaper American food in, then they're going to have to take a second look at it. They're going to have to get a food plan that actually involves British production. And then not only does the inheritance tax not make sense, but hopefully we will have a broader settlement that is kinder to British farmers.
Yes, yes, that does make sense. And just to touch on something that you mentioned there about the lowering of food standards because of Northern Ireland. Again, this comes back to, you know, Ireland was always going to be a significant issue in Brexit, and it's not going to ever not be. So Northern Ireland, essentially, because it is acting as an EU member state in lots of ways, is the key really to this deregulation, isn't it? Because is it right that Northern Ireland will not be allowed to incorporate cheap, low standard American food because it's too low standard? It wouldn't qualify. The EU would not allow food that is that low quality on its marketplace.
Yes, yes, it is, Nick, because they want to protect the single market. The
Yes.
single market is like, it's filtered, it's totally filtered, and it has standards. Of course, there are, like we had the horse meat scandal, there are
Hmm.
criminals that abuse it,
Of
but it's
course.
minimal, which is why the food poisoning situation is so much better in Europe than it is in many
Hmm.
other countries across the world. So
Hmm.
it is about protecting the quality of the food and also the brands of the food. So
Hmm.
we've lost all of those protections around Stilton cheese or pork pies and all of those sort of things from coming out of the European Union. And then you've got China and Russia and those sort of countries that want to mimic these products, which have got protections within the EU single market, which make them
Hmm.
exclusive and then help your economy,
Yes,
because the world
absolutely.
wants champagne or
Hmm.
buffalo mozzarella or
Hmm.
all of those sort of things. It's the, I suppose it's those sort of things that once you decide to deregulate and compete with mass producers like China as a tiny country, you sort of, well, what on earth are we doing?
Yeah.
Why would why would you decide to go and join that when we've actually were in the sort of 6-star hotel, as it were?
Yes, the ring-fenced single market. And I think the other thing with that, if we're going to talk about food safety, is also the fact that we are now no longer under ECJ jurisdiction. So any food that we do import from the EU, if you buy something, as you mentioned, we've had the horse meat scandal. Of course, everywhere there will be dodgy people and dodgy sellers and criminals who will sell substandard stuff. But if you are a British importer and you import from the EU and the onus is on you as an importer, if you do that and something goes wrong and it's substandard, say, for example, it is horse meat, when we were in the single market, we could prosecute the seller under the jurisdiction of the ECJ. British businesses can no longer do that because if they now import some horse meat from Germany, for example, there is no overarching sort of police force, essentially. So Britain really is out in the wilderness here. And being outside the single market, as previously mentioned, is just awful for British businesses. And it seems that you've got something here that really highlights the problems that we have from being outside of the single market in the EU. And Northern Ireland is going to be key to all of this. So, we'll look forward to, obviously, we're in the best possible place to be updated. As ever, follow us at the Pod Food Fighters social media, but also Liz Webster, head of Save British Farming on social media, is obviously Liz is pumping out this information as best she can, as well as living a life and running a farm and everything else that she's doing. So, well, brilliant. Let's look forward to hopefully something positive there and good news for farmers and hopefully good news for all of us in that our food standards will remain high. So on to our next topic for this week, which, Liz, you sent an article this week that was in The Economist. And I sort of took the slant here that it was hailing the production of lab-processed food, including meat, as a good thing. You are obviously, I'm guessing, both of you probably not too keen on lab-processed meat in particular. What's your take on this article, Liz? We will come to you, Ollie, for your view. But Liz, just intro what you forwarded me this week.
There is a lot of noise, particularly vegans are very excited at the thought of lab-grown meat because it's kill-free. You don't have to exploit animals, as they say, and so it makes them feel good about eating meat, which is a bizarre thing. As it is, they eat burgers, which are not burgers, but they still want to eat meat, I think. And I suppose we are omnivores, so I'm sure that the desire to eat these things is still there, but. Again, it does bring in the EU rules. These novelty foods are actually very problematic. To grow meat in a lab requires a lot of chemicals, and a lot of those chemicals are a problem to health. So it is in many ways, if you look at a heavily processed piece of food and you're aware of nutrition, you would think, I'm not going to eat that. I mean, I personally try and avoid fast food as much as I possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, the lab-grown meat is a really massive red flag. I mean, I would rather eat some grass if I was hungry than eat lab-grown meat because it is full of chemicals, and it's really not good for the environment, and it's not good for your health. And all it's giving is the corporations a way of having complete control of the food chain. They don't need to worry about speaking to farms and when animals are ready to go to slaughter or whatever else. It's actually seamless for them because it's grown and controlled in a lab, and they will have absolute control of the whole process, pretty much as they have now with the clothing industry. Most people wear synthetic fibers. I mean, I'm older than you. I remember when we first had crimpling come through, and it was terrible, and no one really wanted to wear it. Only people that were forced to wear it because of finances had to wear it. And I guess that the corporations want to get to a point where everybody, or the majority, will eat this form of processed food. And it's fine with clothing. You don't eat it. I mean, I've got processed fabric on now from
Liz, just to confirm,
Zara.
for those of us who don't think, we forget where clothes used to come from. Clothing didn't used to be mass produced in factories, did it?
No, as I think, when I was a child, everybody wore cotton and wool. And there was a good reason for getting rid of wool. It was hard to wash and dry. And the synthetic fibers now are great. But you don't eat this. You are
Exactly.
what you eat.
Yes.
And so if you're eating food which is heavily processed and controlled by corporations. And then they've also got control of the health system privately, like they have in America.
Mhm.
They can literally control your whole life by feeding you rubbish, making you spend a lot of money in the health service, and that's it. You won't live too long because you'll be eating carcinogenic products.
Yes, I mean, I think there are two separate issues there with the healthcare system, but to focus on what we're particularly pushing here is this idea of essentially food that is going to be worse for us. We will be less healthy as a nation if we incorporate an American-style food system, which is huge commercialization of things, lower food standards, big corporations trying to make as much money as they can, and ultimately not really caring too much about what we eat because they will get away with maximum profits. They will stick to the lowest possible standards that they can so that they can just increase profit margins for investors and shareholders and the like. So it is very scary. And it's a very, very good comparison that you make with the clothing industry because, yes, clothing is mass produced and it doesn't really matter to us physically and health-wise what goes into those clothes because we wear them. Whereas food is obviously a point that you've just very well made. If it goes into us and is bad for us, then we really have to fight against this stuff. So thank you. Ollie, as a farmer, when you hear about people growing, meat in labs and all of this lab-grown food, what does it make you think? And, what's your take on this?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily less healthy. I just don't know. That's not my area. Personally, I'm not that concerned about it, but there are a few things that are a bit strange. So one of which is the corporate point, which Liz has just made. Characters like George Monbiot, who's seen as a left-wing firebrand, campaigns against the social democratic settlement in the countryside, small worker-owned economic units that are farms. He doesn't want those. Those are very bad. Those are unethical, etc., etc. But he does
Why?
want.
Why does he not? Why doesn't he want them, Ollie?
Well, I mean that's a very large question.
Right.
Why doesn't I would argue because he just has a disposition against farmers, but he would object to that characterization. He says lots of things. He thinks that culture is he actually says that poetry is one of the greatest threats to life on earth because it perpetuates rural culture. So it is very much a he's not very keen on the rural worker, but instead of that, you see, he wants big factories that produce food for cities within cities so that you can return the land
And is
to
this an
itself.
environmental argument? Is this about,
Of
the
sorts,
CO2, the
of
emissions?
sorts. But the point being though is that it's sort of it's a vision of the food system that doesn't have people in it. It's a food system without farmers. So there is an element of it that I think is threatening, but it doesn't mean necessarily that it's a good idea or will work.
The truth of the matter is that it isn't environmentally, and there have been studies, it isn't environmentally positive because they need huge amounts of energy. And then the chemicals as well need huge amounts of energy to produce them. And the animals that eat grass don't cost. We have to feed them, but they feed themselves for a lot of a lot of the time by going out and eating grass. So there is not a good environmental argument for this.
Yes.
Also, the
Mm.
packaging side of this lab-grown meat is fascinating because it doesn't have the same protections that natural meat has. So it has to be filled with a lot of chemicals, and then it's got to be heavily packaged as well because the air itself will contaminate the meat. So I wouldn't eat it.
Yeah, well,
I
Liz
No.
just
again
wouldn't eat it.
So Liz again makes a very good point, which is that you can't create something from nothing. So the stuff that meat will be grown from will have to be mined or farmed somehow, which then potentially means it won't be a kill-less system that's producing it, because of course even vegan agriculture involves killing lots of pests and bugs and such. But fundamentally, it's there's a production side to this that is often missed. So when I was at university, I'm not against veganism. I think there are reasonable arguments for veganism, and if
Yeah,
an
absolutely.
important function of food is how we relate to the world around us, and if people want to feel that they're adding value to themselves as a citizen by a vegan diet, then that's fine. But I used to occasionally talk to the vegans who would be protesting on the high street, and once they had some cheese, there was some vegan cheese that they were giving out, and some people think I'm posh, and I'm not. I don't know anything about cheese, but they were like, try the cheese. So I tried the cheese, and they were all staring at me very intently. And I was just like, oh, it just tastes like cheese to me. And then they were like rejoicing. They were like, oh my
That's
goodness,
a gotcha for them, is it?
we've won him over. We've won the farmer over because he said it just tastes like cheese. But then I was like, yeah, but it's not made out of grass, is it? And then they were like, oh, what? Not even considered that. But crucially, is it up to about 70% even of the land in Britain is basically only useful for grass? So if we want to use it productively, it can only really produce ruminant animals. It can produce cows, milk, beef, or sheep, wool, mutton, right?
Because they graze on the grass.
Because they graze on the grass. Now, obviously, if you had a vegan here, they would be saying, well, you could rewild the land, which is then a whole other discussion. But fundamentally, there is a very, very, very strong productive reason to use that land for production of these things. So it may be possible to displace that industry, get rid of the farmers, just have factories that produce lab-grown meat. But is that the best use of resources that we have in this country? I don't know. I don't see it as particularly threatening because you can produce actual meat quite efficiently without very much labour on grass. So
Yes.
they're going to have to beat that.
I think that it's fascinating that they go on about cows farting causing climate change. Nobody ever talks about the manufacturing of packaging or actually the manufacturing of synthetic clothing. And no one ever talks about the impact of the use of that energy to create those products. It's all about, look at the cows, they're doing it. And that is because I think they want to push more people into thinking they're doing something good by not eating meat or by eating synthetic meat. And it is really subliminal messaging to push people to believe that. It's nudging.
Well, I do
and
think,
ultimately it is not truthful.
No, but there are valid...
Where we are now with the clothing is that only the Russian oligarchs and the very wealthy Saudi people who walk around shopping in West One in London, buying clothing at thousands of pounds, can afford natural fibres. Whereas everybody else is buying from the mass-produced stuff, which is owned. Most of the clothing stores now that pump out clothing, very affordable clothing, it's owned by around five corporations. And so once our food is controlled by only a handful of corporations, we are totally trapped. And it will only be the richest in the world that will be able to afford food which is good for you and ensures you a good, long, healthy life. And they're the only ones also that will be able to afford good healthcare.
Yes, no, I do get that argument, but I do need to come back slightly to, to go back to cows farting. Yes, I obviously have heard the argument, but I think worldwide there is an acknowledgement and an acceptance that there is a problem with the temperature of our planet. And I think that solutions are trying to be found across the board for every single industry and every single power source. We do want to solve...
No, it's not rubbish. No, I'll explain it.
I'm just going to make the point very briefly that is there a valid point? Every industry has emissions. Every industry has output that is potentially could be improved upon. And I do think there is some goodwill in the argument about reducing CO2 emissions. And I do understand why people may want to eat less meat if they do genuinely feel that those animals and, if they're mass farmed to a point where they're only existing because we can eat them, and that is therefore contributing to climate change, I don't think that that's an immoral argument for people. And it may be that, yes, they do need to get their food from somewhere, and those other sources of food may come from places that are equally as harming for the planet. But I do understand the argument of people who think ethically, if cows are, to give one example, if cows are mass-produced solely to feed us and that's damaging the planet, then I'm going to make a conscious decision to eat less red meat because I'm concerned about the planet.
Yes. Well, Liz, let me take this. Yes. Well,
I think I may have triggered Liz. I'm a bit worried.
No, it's fine. I'm trying to just make us not look like climate skeptics. Yeah, but you don't want to just shit on the whole thing.
Because these are conversations that everybody's having.
Yeah, well, it's not an unreasonable consumption choice necessarily, but I think the issue is often misrepresented in the public debate. Essentially, there's two different ways of calculating the climate impacts of cows, and
Hmm.
how science works is something is established and then it's challenged and then the new thing becomes established. But, as such, both the new and old thing are technically peer-reviewed established science, right? And this is
Hmm.
what's happened with how we calculate the warming effect of methane. So climate change is normally viewed in terms of the effect of carbon dioxide, which doesn't really decay in the atmosphere. There is, of course, the carbon cycle, but if you put additional carbon in the atmosphere that's external to the carbon cycle, it will just sort of stay there and it will accumulate over time, which causes global warming. So this is why net zero is a thing. You have to
Hmm.
reach net zero. You have to have no additional carbon going into the atmosphere in order to stop the warming, right? So
Hmm.
no carbon emissions. Methane is a little bit more complicated than that because methane does decay into carbon dioxide, and from cows traditionally would have been part of the natural carbon cycle. Now, the focus on cows derives from the fact that methane is more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So, in theory, cows are quite bad for the planet. But because methane decays in the atmosphere over a period of about 10 years, if you have a steady emission of methane, in the long run, it doesn't really cause additional warming beyond the initial emission. If I was to build up a herd of 100 cows,
Hmm.
every year for the first 10 years, the amount of methane in the atmosphere would increase and cause a lot of warming. But then after 10 years, on the 11th year, they would emit methane. But then the first year's methane would decay and no additional warming would be caused. Now, this is very, very
Hmm.
important because
That is
globally,
important.
that is happening. Globally, ruminants are emitting more methane. We're getting more ruminants and it's driving climate change. But crucially, in Britain and in America and probably in a couple of other countries, the number of ruminants we have here is actually declining, which means the
Hmm.
amount of methane that we're putting in the atmosphere is less than the amount that we put in 10 years ago that's decaying, which
Right.
means that beef and dairy production in this country is not driving climate change, right? But
Right.
the reason people get confused about this is that is sort of the new way of looking at it, which is called GWP star, global warming potential star, I believe it is. But the old way, GWP 100, just looks at it's not as dynamic. It just calculates methane as a factor of carbon dioxide. So it treats methane as if it behaves like
Hmm.
carbon dioxide in the atmosphere,
Right.
which it doesn't, which means it overstates the impact of cows in essence.
Yeah.
There are, of course, lots of debates to be had here. You could, for example,
Hmm.
drastically reduce the number of cows we have in this country in order to buy some time for other carbon intensive industries to become more efficient and, make offsets or whatnot. What I would push for is that we should increase production. Um, no one is suggesting this, but if you have countries like Cuba, say, where cows would suffer from heat stress trying to make cheese, it would be much better for us in our climate to produce that cheese because we
Hmm.
would need less cows and therefore less methane emissions. And then we could export it, which would be good for our balance of payments and jobs. And
Yeah.
crucially,
Hmm.
climate change globally. And climate change is
Yes.
global.
Yes, well, and that's exactly why I brought up that point. I knew it wasn't going to go down. When I'm talking to two farmers here, and I'm talking about people not eating meat, but these conversations are having, and people are having these conversations. And Ollie, what you've just said there, I did not know that, and I'm sure people that will be listening to this, hopefully, will now be slightly better informed about the need for
Yes.
cattle farming and the way that methane behaves in
There's
particular. Liz,
there's
Liz,
also
obviously, I have to let
another
you talk here.
critical point about this is about how the cows are reared.
Hmm.
And this is a really massive point that we always make about Brexit. Most of the cattle in Britain are actually reared sustainably. They eat grass. They go outside and they
Hmm.
eat grass, and they're in sheds in the winter. Not all of them, and they have to go into sheds because of the wet in
Hmm.
the winter. When you go to other countries that mass produce cattle, particularly if they're owned by big corporations like JPS, they're
Hmm.
actually reared in cattle lots, in feedlots. And so they never go out and eat grass. They are fed. So the feed that they have is usually grain. And so that in itself is more energy intensive because
Yeah,
it's got to be produced and then fed to them.
of
So
course.
when our animals eat the grass, they sequester carbon because Grass only sequesters carbon when it's cut regularly. If you allow the grass to grow, it takes in less carbon,
I did not know
photosynthesis.
that. Okay.
So if you are concerned about the environment and climate change and keeping down your carbon footprint, the best
Mhm.
thing to do is to eat locally as possible, because you've got no food miles, sustainably reared British beef.
Yeah, it makes sense. And Ollie, I really liked your point about dairy herds in incredibly hot places. I think it seems apparent to me from what you guys have told me, Britain is a good country climate-wise for example dairy farming, isn't it? And
Yeah.
is it one of our strengths? Should we actually be trying to say to people, look, Britain has the right climate. We're lucky in this country. We can produce dairy and meat from cattle incredibly effectively, and actually it's much better to do it here than it is to do somewhere that's incredibly hot.
Yeah, I think so. And I had this argument actually, funnily enough, with a professor at the end of my Oxford degree, who was like a historian of the Mughal Empire. I can't even remember how you say it. Doesn't matter. Basically, very,
Mogul.
very prestigious historian, not necessarily an authority on agricultural policy. And I knew slightly more about this than she did. So she was making bold statements, and I sort of eventually backed her into a corner where she was saying, we must reduce our meat consumption so that we have a diplomatic advantage over countries like India, who have to actually do have an emissions problem coming
Mm.
from their bovine production. But like, what a ridiculous thing to say. If we, as a country, reduced our production, I'm not necessarily talking about consumption here, it will not reduce demand globally, because it's all about just global inequality. I mean, we in northwestern Europe have long had access to beef. We quite
Hmm.
like that, and now you have people in other parts of the world that have not been so privileged are now thinking, well, we would also like to, eat beef, have a car. Those things are good. We would like to do them as well, and
Hmm.
then we're expected to go, no, actually, that was no, don't you can't do that. We have done it for a long time, but it was bad, and you're not allowed to do it at all.
Yeah.
It's very, very silly. Demand for meat globally will increase. And we can debate whether or not that is a good or a bad thing. And I think that, globally it probably is a bad thing. But it's going to happen, which means we have to be thinking critically about how we produce it. And I think
Hmm.
British production is a very important component of that, because we are so well disposed to grow grass and keep cows at the temperature that they function best at, which means that climatically we can produce, cereals, in most instances, vegetables, if we had more staff perhaps, and meat and dairy very, very, very effectively. And other places can produce strawberries and bananas and oranges and such. We need to be specialising in these things, which we are very good at, actually. We are amongst genuinely the best in the world at producing stuff in terms of yield per land utilised. British agriculture is a fantastic national success story that no one ever talks about. But these should be maintained as such, and this should be
Hmm.
seen as part of the strategy to fight climate change globally, rather than a threat to it, as it is so
Yes.
often presented.
And I think, again, to come back to our central point here, which is that if we then go down the American trade deal route of, deregulation, lowering standards, we will lose all this, won't we? Because essentially one of the things that could happen is huge commercialisation, which would mean the end of British farming as we know it, which would mean the end of these well-maintained, well-brought-up, well-produced cattle. And that would be replaced with a system of mass-farmed, low standard food that would essentially be made in a completely different way with much, much lower standards. So that's what we're fighting for, essentially, isn't it? We should be waving the flag. British farming is incredibly good and should be seen. Are we saying really it's a national asset? Farming in this country is an asset that we should be championing.
If you voted Brexit and you want sovereignty, it's never been clear to me why you couldn't understand that Brexit sees us flooded with cheap imports, which means that you have no sovereignty because you're relying on others to feed you.
Hmm.
And we
I don't think
already
lots of
can't
people.
have.
I don't think lots of people even thought that far into the sort of the process of what would happen with Brexit.
But
If I'm honest,
even
it was
now,
immigration.
Nick, even now, people defend Brexit for sovereignty. And then
Hmm.
when you point this out to them, they still can't understand that. And this
No.
whole thing about sovereignty is actually a nonsense, isn't it? Because We lost the sovereignty argument, actually, over a century ago, when we didn't decide whether all cars in the world were left-hand or right-hand drive, which is, why we've got these problems. So
Was that the
sovereignty is
moment?
about decisions making. Well, we lost the empire. We were
Yeah.
leading the world. And
We
after
lost the
World War
empire and
II,
people
we
started
lost the
driving on the
empire.
wrong side of the road. Unbelievable.
Well, that's why we have got a mess of two systems.
That's not living, yeah.
And South Africa, they drive on the same side as us because they were part
They
of the
do, yeah,
empire.
they do in lots of
And
Commonwealth
so
countries.
these
India, they do,
things,
yeah.
I actually
decisions
think
about what standards you have. We were in the leading system in the EU, which was
Yes,
leading
we were a
the way.
decision. Yes, we were instrumental in every single decision that was made, and we made a lot of the laws. I totally take your point. This idea that sovereignty involves flooding ourselves with cheap imports over which we've got no control over the standards is a fascinating point.
I do think that the left-hand side of the road is objectively the correct side. And the reason I think that is because if you're driving a machine, like a tractor or a telehandler or something, the controls are on the right-hand side. So it's either difficult or impossible to exit the vehicle from the right-hand side. So you pull over on the left and get out onto the verge. Whereas in Europe, that's still true. People are still typically right-handed. The controls are still on the right. But then you have to get out into the traffic. Silly and therefore wrong.
Okay.
Well, look,
Well,
the Americans made that decision on the other side. And as I said, we largely lost the argument because the majority of cars are right-hand drive.
yes. Well,
But
I
what's the
didn't
point,
expect
though?
this conversation to end here.
Is there a reason for that? Can any of us think of an advantage to driving on the
It's the
right-hand
same as
side of the road?
VHS and Betamax going back, isn't it? I mean,
I'll be honest. I've driven in Europe, and I write with my left hand, but I'm kind of like whatever. I don't write with my right hand. But yeah, I've never had a major issue transferring to the European side of the road. But it's not. I don't lose much sleep over what side of the road we drive on. I'll be honest. But yes, well, we've gone from factory produced meat to which side of the road we should all be driving on. If you have any views on that, please let us know. Okay, fantastic. Well, lab grown meat may not be all it's cracked up to be, but I think essentially the point comes back to the fact that British farming is done well. And a very, very interesting conversation. I've just learned quite a lot there about methane in particular and cattle production in this country. I hope everybody listening has too. Right, while we have time, it's not been, oh gosh, I don't know how many weeks we're going to say this for and how many weeks we will continue to say this. It's not been a very good week for Keir Starmer, has it?
It's absolutely disastrous, and he's gone. It couldn't be happening to him at the worst time, going into conference, and he is in a terrible position. And Andy Burnham is there as the clear challenger, pushing ahead for a future. And yeah, it's a car crash. How long can he struggle on for? I don't know. It's not looking good for Keir Starmer. And
No.
we know that, there's a by-elections coming as well. I think there's probably a couple in the wings, and that's only going to add pressure, plus the spring elections. So I think Starmer will be gone probably by next summer.
I would like to think I'm going to go and put my optimistic hat on here. I'm in the same mindset that I had when I wanted Keir Starmer to win the election and lead the Labour Party, that he is not that long in to his term. And I think the most optimistic take on this that I can have is that there is a bigger plan and a broader picture. And he understands, and the Labour Party understand, that the mess they were left with was so significant that it's going to take laying a lot of groundwork to turn the tide. And I'm just hoping, maybe foolishly, that there is a bigger plan here and that he has some backing and that there is a plan that he can't say all of it. Maybe part of it's rejoin the single market, but obviously he can't say that now. I don't know. Yes, there is. It seems like unless there's a really, really solid groundwork that's been done in the planning stages, that there is faith in them, that they've almost given him a blank check to carry on. He's in big trouble unless there's something like that going on, isn't there? Surely, Ollie. I mean, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I feel Keir Starmer's not going to get a particularly good write-up in the history books because he didn't win the election. I know that Labour will think
Yes,
Morgan
good
McSweeney
point.
was some sort of
Yeah.
mastermind, but the Tories lost it, right? They got a
Yeah, I
smaller
voted
vote
to get
share.
them out, as did most people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they got a smaller vote share than Corbyn did, and they keep talking
know.
about how bad he was, right? But then Starmer got in, already quite unpopular from the outset, and sort of said, "Oh, I don't care if you all hate me. Actually, we're just going to get on with it." And then he's just never recovered from that. It's just gotten worse, and
But
the
he's made some
storytelling.
awful decisions
The
too. I mean,
storytelling is atrocious. Like, I mean,
yeah.
Christ, you have to at least try to take people with you. Like even in the past week, he was, you had the whole Mandelson thing, and then the McSweeney donations thing, and then they announced digital ID. What? I mean, the entire story of the
When he
Labour
could have
government has been.
announced we were going back in the single market, it would have been a
Yeah.
lot. He would have
Oh,
Gosh,
actually
I mean,
bounced
where are
back
the...
up.
Is it
the
like
entire.
tacticians? I mean, who's across this stuff? Who goes and does something like that? I mean, they've already had the winter fuel payments, which was a car crash and just totally unnecessary.
Yeah,
It's not really very beneficial compared to lots of other things they could have done. At this week, when they've got everything going on, who made the decision to announce digital ID cards this week? And who went, yeah, that's a good idea. We'll do that.
Well, the entire project of this government has been to alienate their own base. I mean, they were elected on a platform of change, and they've essentially continued what Rishi Sunak was trying to do. But they've been alienating their own base in favour of the right wing, and then they've just annoyed all the right wing with the.
And you can't outflank the right, because the right will just keep going right. You can't go further right than the
They've
far
annoyed
right, because they'll just keep
everybody,
moving,
It's nuts.
It's
I don't
unbelievable.
know.
It is.
It's student
But also,
politics.
your hope of Starmer coming good, Nick, is you're in a cul-de-sac there, because because we've told you he's legislated for an American deal, and they've legislated to deregulate.
Yes.
You cannot do that and go into the single market.
No, I know. And there's an element of devil's advocate to what I'm doing there. And when words are coming out of your mouth and you don't really believe them, that's kind of, I think, what I was doing just then.
Well, we all need hope. We all need
Yes,
hope.
that's
but
what
the
it
hope
is.
doesn't lie with Keir Starmer. He is a dead man walking.
He is, I think, in lots of ways. And again, I think it comes back to a point we were sort of making last week when we were talking about the Lib Dems. There is just a massive, massive, vacuous, gaping hole in the centre-left of our politics that just no one seems to want to lay down their flag and go, look, I can see where this is, and we're going to take this. We're going to do things like take us back into the single market and sweep up these votes. And I don't understand why the Labour Party aren't able to see that there is this gaping hole. I don't know where. Well, we do know it's the Morgan McSweeneys and people who are advocating this push to the right, isn't it? Where have Labour gone?
Probably all of those dodgy donations that weren't put through the proper process, which also was exposed recently. So there's a lot of things that have gone on. So democracy for sale, cash for questions,
MAGA
all these
hats
things.
as well. Oh, man.
Oh, Steve Reed, the housing minister, going all MAGA. Yeah, what was it? Build, baby, build.
He's just an alien. Oh, my God. It's just unbelievable. If anyone hasn't seen what he's put on his Twitter recently, it is worth looking at. We'll tweet it. It's actually so interesting if you unpack it, because he's made like sort of self-congratulatory tripe, but it's like over-edited in a really corny way, but it has like, animated text and transitions and stuff like this, to the point that you think if you were able to do these things, you could make a good video. Like they've done lots of different types of editing within it, but it's just so unbelievably bad. It really does seem like a spoof. It's just...
from somebody who works in TV,
satire.
you can have the best editor in the world, but if the material that you've got is absolutely awful, it's very, very difficult to make a good programme.
But Steve Reed is very, very close to McSweeney and Glassman, and he's also Rachel Reeves's favourite minister. We heard that on a Spectator podcast. So when he was still in DEFRA. So for us farmers, Steve Reed is just red rag to a bull. So now he's going build, baby, build with red MAGA hats. Yes, it just shows how wrong their optics are. They've got it wrong. Because that just isn't, I don't think, where the country are, particularly
who in the Labour Party wants to mimic MAGA. It's just the opposite
I
thing.
just don't
He
understand. They've
belongs
had
in the
all
Reform
this
Party,
time
right?
to plan this
Yes.
stuff. They were in opposition for so long, and I thought they'd got it so right in the lead up to the election. There were good people they were recruiting, and it's just turned out to be an absolute car crash. I'm mystified as to how badly it's gone. If I'm honest, it's impressive. I mean, it was quite hard to get it this badly wrong.
Yeah.
Oh well,
Yeah, I agree.
let's see where we go next week because yes, it's there really is a lot going on. So I'll look forward to this conversation next week, as I hope you all will. As ever, Liz and Ollie, thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for listening. We will be putting stuff out on socials as we have been, so please like, share, subscribe, and get the message out there. So yes, Liz, Ollie, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick.
and we will see you all soon.